Live from Austin, Texas. I'm Charlie with your co-host.
Andrei from Rockville, Maryland. And today we're going to talk about kind of a more obscure topic. Did you guys know that at one point there was a Greek presence all the way in like Central Asia and India of all places? Kind of crazy. So we'll kind of delve into that a little bit today and cover the history of this like forgotten land and culture. It's actually very fascinating. So I guess just to give you some brief background, this was to be after Alexander the Great conquered the area. He conquered the Persian Empire. He was from Macedonia. Conquered it very quickly, made this huge empire. He died of a fever in Babylon, or some say it was poisoned. Well, whatever happened in the aftermath, his generals ended up basically fighting and squabbling over the spoils of his empire, and this became known as the War of the Diadochoi. His generals, basically, they ended up having to split his empire into 4 or 5 kind of different sub kingdoms. One being the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. The Macedonians had theirs, the Antigonids. The Seleucids were like the biggest, and they covered the area of like Asia, like most of Persia and Afghanistan, the east. And that's the area that's going to kind of concern our topic today, because it's about the kingdom known as the Greco Bactrians and the Indo Greeks. Charlie, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that sort of got us talking about this is, of course, we talk about other topics off podcasts as well. And we were talking about, just the recent events, and we don't need to go too much detail. Of course, the Afghanistan invasion, Iraq war, and Kandahar province was always in the news. And I only learned recently Kandahar comes from Iskandar, which is a transliteration of Alexandroupolis, which is Alexandria. And as you know, Alexander, he conquered all these cities. He set up Alexandria in Egypt, which is the most famous one, but he was constantly renaming cities, and those were centers of Greek influence. And we recently heard that, like, there's so much excavation. We know Greece, man. Greece gets all this excavation. It's a fairly safe, very safe country, I would argue, probably one of the safest, especially because they rely on tourism so much. But Afghanistan, we don't get to do archaeology over there, right? So there's all these like Greek cities that haven't been excavated at all. And that's what kind of drew our attention here.
Yeah, exactly. So, as you might know, Alexander founded cities called Alexandria all over his empire. The most famous, of course, being the one that lasted, which was in Egypt and still around today. But there were others, including many out here. And yeah, some say he was this is an act of vanity, but it was a different time, and the fact that the Greeks were able to actually plant all these different cities in these far-flung places is kind of pretty amazing, and that they were able to bring like a Hellenistic culture to these lands. And of course, it wasn't all necessarily settled by Greeks themselves, but a blend of Greek elites and culture with like the local people, kind of making this syncretic melting pot culture. It's just pretty fascinating stuff. It was. I'll get into some of that stuff kind of later about proto-globalization and all that. But so basically how it started, you had this Seleucid dynasty that ruled a large part of Alexander's Eastern Empire for a while. As they were getting in trouble with various nomadic tribes, the Parthians, part of that empire, a satrapy known as Bactria in like the northwest of it, or northeast of it, in what is today like Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, that kind of area. It broke off because the local people had formed their own kind of culture and didn't want to be under the king, which is actually based in originally Babylon and then Syria, way further west. So they kind of used this opportunity while the Seleucids were distracted to declare independence. And I believe this is called the first dynasty was the Diotid dynasty by this guy Diodotus. Later came the Euthydemids and Eucratidids. This isn't particularly that relevant, but just kind of different dynasties that ruled this kingdom. What they were like really known for was like back in ancient times, Bactria, as ruled by the Greeks, was known as the land of 1,000 cities, which is kind of crazy to think about because very few of them seem to have survived to history. They say it was a very wealthy land, and they haven't really been able to recover that much. However, there is one city called Icanum, which is now on the border of like Afghanistan and Tajikistan, I believe, which was a like full Hellenistic city. This thing had a gymnasium, it had a theater, it had like columns, it had like agora plaza, it had like sanctuaries, marketplace, all the trappings of like Hellenistic culture, and various statues and busts out of marble in that style, which is kind of crazy. And they also found like I think the single largest like gold coin that was kind of minted in antiquity in this kingdom. This like gigantic coin the size of like a palm. Because I guess those kings wanted to display a measure of luxury and power. It's not really known exactly how far this kingdom extended, but it's thought to have been pretty widespread. At one point, during the later part of the dynasty, they even spread into India. So like they went to northwestern India, and eventually the Greco Bactrians themselves succumbed to other invasions, and their descendants kind of moved to India, became the Indo-Greeks. And over there, it became even more interesting in that this was where the fusion or melding of Greco, well, not quite Roman, but yeah, Greek mythological culture and Indian culture in the form of like Buddhism actually came into being. This is a super fascinating time because this is a few hundred years after the Buddha himself. Up until then, the Buddha had not really been represented that much in physical form, much more in a sort of symbolic form of like a lotus flower. But when the Greeks arrived in the area and established like the dominance in part of the Indian subcontinent, they began this new art style called the Gandhara art style, in which it's kind of a realistic looking. Like you had like the Buddha depicted in a human form, semi-idealized, but like in a way still very realistic. Like the folds of his cloak and everything like that were like full of details and naturalistic elements. So this is very fascinating. And one of the really cool things was the Buddha's protector in Indian mythology called, or in the culture called Vajrapani, was often Hercules. So you had Hercules like with his beard and his club and like big kind of naked muscle bound guy standing next to the Buddha as his protector. This is the fascinating kind of example of how these two cultures kind of came together. And it's not known how many of the Greeks there converted to Buddhism. One of their most famous kings named Menander certainly did, and he really became a devout kind of Buddhist, and there were records of him interacting with all kinds of gurus and important other kings in India, talking about Buddhism and his story, his kind of interaction with it. So you had some very interesting intersections of culture here.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I saw like even a depiction of Buddha with Zeus.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting just seeing these two cultures kind of merging together. Ultimately, just to kind of draw back a little bit on former episodes as well. I mean, these are two different branches of Indo-European culture that have been separated for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, and now they're coming back together through these conquests. And it's really cool to see this shift in Buddhist art and how things are changing. What do you think was like the cause of the change? It was just like the Buddhists saw this Greek art and they wanted to kind of merge their two cultures together, or convince people to join their religion, or maybe vice versa.
I don't know if it was like there could be kind of many things here. I mean, to take the more cynical and realist route, rulers want to sometimes use religion as a form of like controlling the people. Maybe he wanted to show his mostly Indian or mixed subject population that he was sort of a man of the people, and not some aloof foreigner who came here and like brought his own culture and religion. So he decided to kind of convert to them as a show of like solidarity that basically had kind of gone um, native, so to speak. But
Yeah.
out of this interaction produced some very fascinating like um, art forms, and supposedly like this kind of Buddhism was then exported northward. So oddly enough, like these Greeks probably encountered Buddhism before East Asians like Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese did, even though we associate kind of Buddhism with those cultures more. So the Greco Bactrians were conquered by these nomadic, probably like Tokharian or Iranian people called the USZ, who then adopted a lot of Hellenistic culture in their coins and their art and whatnot. And they founded this thing called the Kushan Empire, which is actually quite significant in the area. The Kushans went back north toward like the Tarim Basin and Taklamakan Desert and spread the faith of Buddhism there. And from all those like nomadic caravans from there, it went east into China. And then from there, the rest was history. And that's kind of how that branch of Buddhism spread, even though it was originally from India. I'm not saying the Greeks played a direct role in this, but indirectly they certainly were a part of it. I think they helped kind of bolster, the faith of Buddhism a lot during that era. And then I think Ashoka, one of the most famous Indian kings around this time of Alexander, he was also a Buddhist, so he exerted a lot of influence in the subcontinent. Interestingly enough, Buddhism did not last in India, even though it started there, and it took off more in other countries. Unfortunately, Hinduism eventually kind of made a comeback and started eroding the gains that Buddhism had made in the subcontinent. But still, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you've done like an incredible tour de force of representing everything from syncretism to kind of the spread of Greek culture merging into this melting pot into Greco-Buddhism. And I guess ultimately the we see like the physical representations, but I think it's fair to assume there could have been a lot of written. Like you said, it was a full city. There was a theater. There probably was a library. We may not; those documents may not exist, but it's fair to assume that maybe like the writings of the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita were intertwined with like Greek manuscripts as well. So it's kind of fascinating to wonder what sort of philosophical or cultural thought was produced at the time as well.
Right, because like as we were saying in another podcast on Dumazu and transfunctionalism, kind of we touched on how like the Homeric epics and the Indian, the Vedas and the epics there, the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita did have some interesting commonalities, I guess partly stemming from that Indo-European root. But some of this might just be, that's how epic stories are.
Yeah.
It's hard to say how they interacted in text later,
Mhm.
but I mean we're just kind of lightly touching on topic. I'm sure there could be a lot more said of this about how this religion influenced the Greeks. I will say one other interesting thing is I noted how this art form it influenced in Indian art for a while. It also supposedly influenced Chinese art indirectly. There's an offshoot of the Greco Bactrians that went further into Central Asia, and they even might have come in contact with the Han Chinese. And they had like a city there, Alexandria Escate, and I think that the Chinese were looking for allies to fight like the Xiongnu or possibly like the ancestors of the Huns at the time, and they noticed that the people of these Greco Bactrian cities had like really strong horses, and they wanted to kind of talk to them and negotiate an exchange of like horses and possibly economic aid for their wars, but the Greeks didn't really want to, or something like that. So then the Chinese embassy or like ambassador was turned back. The emperor then got angry or jealous and decided to send like a punitive force against that city, and they kind of destroyed them. But supposedly he absorbed the influence, artistic influence, to create the famous terracotta army out of some of that, like, Greek influenced art, supposedly. This is a bit of a stretch, and it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's 100%. I can't say whether it's true or not, but it's definitely like interesting speculation.
The timing at least adds up because the
Yeah,
terracotta army was built after that. So I mean, you could say in theory, like the timing added up. It's yeah, it's interesting to know because the terracotta army represents kind of this shift in Chinese art. Like you hadn't really seen those types of figurines before. I've actually been there, and it's really incredible. Um, it's really something else. I hadn't thought about that until kind of looking into this, but it does seem like, well, those guys kind of look like what Greeks might have thought, to make statues of in Athens if you brought an Athenian to China.
right, right. Which so how was that anyway? How was the?
Oh, it's really cool. I mean, it's massive. Evidently, it was only discovered in the 70s by a farmer because, like, the emperor, he wanted his entire army to be buried with him, so he covered it all up, and then it was sort of lost through time. And then some farmer discovered a head, and they built massive museums there. But the interesting thing is, they built all these. So there's like a museum on top of it, so you can go there, you can see like this massive army, hundreds and hundreds. But the Chinese government actually doesn't want to excavate the entire thing because they've discovered where the emperor should be, but they think that the emperor should be maintained. So it's interesting that the modern Chinese government wants to give respect and say, hey, we're not going to excavate this because this is like the tomb of the emperor. Um,
Huh.
so it's kind of cool. It's interesting to note also Reagan went there in the 80s and took photos with Nancy Reagan amongst like they went down into with the soldiers, which you're not allowed to do as a normal tourist, but I don't know. Interesting things. It's a cool place. It's like in central China, like west, like as far west as you can get before you get kind of to the difficult terrain. So it makes sense that they might have been in contact with those Bactrian kingdoms to the west of
Yeah,
them.
which was, I mean, it's, I'm glad to hear that the Chinese still do care enough about ancient history and respect it enough to try to preserve it like that, because say what you go about the modern like Communist Party and what their priorities are, but I think, but it's still an essential part of like Chinese culture, of course, so that it makes sense that they would try to like preserve and highlight that. Although they might disagree with our kind of theory about this, though, and probably say it's completely a
Hey,
name.
we're entitled to have unique opinions, right? As long as we can sort of defend
Yeah,
them somehow.
at least we're not under the Great Firewall of China, So,
Right, right, right.
still in the free world, baby. Um,
Yeah.
keep on rocking. But yeah, so it's kind of a brief overview of a lot of these kingdoms. Eventually, the Indo-Greeks died out too. They were conquered or faded away by around the time of Christ. But interestingly, out of all like the Hellenistic kingdoms, they're the ones that still kind of survived the latest into like what became the Roman era, because the Romans couldn't really reach them; they were too far to the east. Um, so yeah, I mean, the really cool thing about this is that there's probably still a lot more out there to find, but the unfortunate thing is that it's in Afghanistan, and these are kind of unstable places, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that kind of thing, and it's difficult for archaeologists to really, excavate and dig here, because of the current situation, the Taliban, everything like that. Apparently, this was found, I think, in the 60s originally, under when Afghanistan had a king, and it was still kind of okay. Like I've spoken to a friend of mine from there, and he said that before the Taliban took over, in the 80s, Afghanistan was actually more developed than it is today, and a little more.
Yeah, you see photos of like college age girls in skirts in the
Yeah,
70s in Afghanistan. It's pretty crazy considering how different it is now.
exactly. And it's the same in Iran too, before the revolution there. Like, they're like significantly Western influence under their king, but things happen. And not to like make any political stand on things like that. We'll veer away from that, but you know, it is what it is. Um, One thing about the area that I will say is Afghanistan has always been very difficult historically to conquer. Alexander was one of the few to actually do it. And even then, like it wasn't a place that was easy to govern. But it's
It's
still a
just such a rugged terrain, right? You can't build like it's hard to, I mean, you could build a train system, I guess, nowadays, but it's hard to like historically have built a train system there. It's all mountainous, there's all these, rugged terrain. It just makes sense. Yeah, it's hard. It may be easy to conquer, to win a battle, but hard to maintain.
actually, yep, yep. As the U.S. has learned, as Soviet Union has learned, the
Yeah.
British, all these other.
Yep,
Well,
exactly. The Russians.
it's a testament to what the Hellenistic states were able to do, that they were able to keep this area under the influence of their culture for like several centuries. So something about like that must have attracted the people and kind of kept it going. So um, hopefully we will learn more about this kind of lost world of Hellenism and
Yeah, I mean, Icon Moon, I mean, it sounds like there could be tons of research done there. And I bet if the area was truly stabilized, man, we could probably find old parchments akin to like how the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden in like areas that are fairly arid over time. And they're probably really interesting fragments existing out there. We just need like peace and time to go look for them.
yeah, well, let's not hold our breath for that one.
Yeah, unfortunately, not soon.
Yeah. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this kind of brief whirlwind tour of the Greek Far East, so to speak, and hopefully we'll keep coming at you with more interesting topics about random stuff all over the world, both in the past and in terms of sci-fi, fantasy, whatever.
Sci-fi in the future, yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Stay tuned. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Nope. Later on, guys.
Peace.